All right. Good morning, everyone. This is an episode of Catholicism in the car, but I am not in the car. I'm in my house doing the classic sit in front of a bookshelf. I seem to see so many people doing this, so I said, what the heck, why not? Today I want to discuss a question which I hope will become a series of questions just on philosophy. And this first question is, are humans innately good? And this is just a fascinating query. If you think about just in Christianity alone, the question, are humans innately good, is hotly contested between Protestants and then more traditional, or I guess maybe you could say more historical Orthodox Christians, the Catholics, the Orthodox, the Oriental Orthodox. So, and then within Protestantism, there are different ideas about this. Are humans innately good? There are some who take the position that that no, humans are not innately good. We are depraved from our conceptions. And then there are some who would say, no, we're not depraved, we're deprived. We are deprived of God's grace and of all goodness. So Catholics definitely take the deprived position, as opposed to a depraved position. Catholics believe that human beings are innately good. And that's something that can never be taken away, either by man's own free choice, or, I'm sure some would say even by God. God could not even take away that goodness, because that would involve annihilation of the individual. So, but besides a religious Christian perspective, how do people look at this question? And I think this is just another. It gets at the depth of who we are as human beings, and it's a wonderful thing to think about. So if you've never really thought deeply about this question, I would ask you to do so. And that's really going to be my purpose here, and that's my purpose with this whole podcast, is to help people to think deeply about things. Whether you're a Catholic, whether you're a Protestant, whether you're an Orthodox or an Oriental Orthodox Christian, right? Whether you're an agnostic or an atheist or a Buddhist or a Hindu, whatever it might be, that we can just begin to think deeply about life, about what actually matters. And I think that will bring us all to a greater understanding of each other. So, are humans innately good? From like a purely philosophical perspective, how would we go about answering this sort of a question? And, that's kind of a difficult one, because the question of innate goodness really implies that somehow that goodness was infused within the being. And that's a difficult thing to come to just from a purely natural perspective. I would argue it is a difficult premise to come to, unless you just choose it and you take that as your starting point. It's not necessary to be religious to believe that humans are innately good. Of course not. It's not necessary, but it follows more easily from at least a theistic perspective, and especially a theistic perspective where one would believe that that deity is good, because at least you could believe in some sort of emanation kind of theory of creation, where that deity emanates his goodness and that goodness becomes the creation. Yeah, I mean, it's just a fascinating question, and I really think that it has implications for the rest of our lives, for how we compose ourselves with other human beings, for how we view how we're supposed to live ethically and morally. It really is a base question that we need to be asking ourselves, and I would argue we need to have answered for ourselves before we can really do much of anything. And it doesn't mean that we're going to stick with that answer for forever, but it does mean that that answer will give us trajectory for how we live our lives. So are human beings innately good? I would argue yes. I'm going to argue yes. And what are the reasons for that? I think really it doesn't come down to looking at anything, trying to deduce from premises, and therefore we can figure out that human beings are innately good. I think this is one of those things where you have to kind of look at what are the effects of the proposition that I'm taking on? What would be the effects of my believing that human beings, and thus myself, are innately good? And I think just from a psychological perspective, the answer to that question, if the answer to that question is yes, then we really, that fills us with dignity, innate human dignity. And if we're not good at that very base level, the whole question about human dignity kind of starts to fall through the cracks, unless you have a deity who, by some sort of divine command theory, gives his creation dignity, or at least certain aspects of his creation, like human beings, gives them dignity. And I just think that's a much shakier position to be on. And I know here, I'm not given any sort of really concrete proof or anything like that. And that's because there's no concrete proof for questions like this. Eventually, when you get to questions that are so deep, as this one is, there's not going to be any sort of a proof that can be given. There can be arguments that can be given that support it, but there's not going to be any conclusive proofs out there. And honestly, that was a big thing for me to come to at one point, especially when I'm thinking about questions of, does God exist? Does he not exist? Should I be a Christian? Should I not be a Christian? And ultimately, I think it's I think it's a toss-up. If you're just looking at that question from a philosophical point of view, I think it's a toss-up. It's a really difficult question, and I completely understand where my atheist and agnostic friends are coming from, because I think if you don't have any sort of theodicy that kind of makes a lot of things make more sense to you, you would just look at the world and you would say, well gosh, it doesn't appear that there's any sort of spiritual realities out there. It doesn't appear that I have a soul, and I've argued before that makes a lot of sense, because especially if you're taking an Aristotelian view of the soul, that the soul then is just the form of the body, and so it doesn't exist without the body. And so the naturalist perspective, saying that, well, if I do have a soul, it dies with me, they're correct. What a Christian theist at least would say is that God after that person dies, would uphold that form separate from the body by a miracle. He would uphold that in existence until, the resurrection, and the second coming. And anyway, that's a rabbit hole we don't need to get down right now. But yeah, are humans innately good? This is just such a wonderful question, and I want us all to be asking ourselves this question, because, oh man, because whether you're a Catholic, an Orthodox, a Protestant, an agnostic, an atheist, a Buddhist, this is something that is just so important to ask. And I realize I'm not saying much here besides that, but yet I am saying a lot, like trying to get people to ask these sorts of deep questions. Am I innately good? And just think about it. Try to argue in your head, like, okay, what are the reasons yes? What are the reasons no? Why would I think that I am? What is goodness? Is this even a question worth asking? If there's no such thing as goodness, then why does it even matter if I'm innately good? If goodness is just a construct of the human mind, as we've talked about in the past with nominalism, the philosophy of nominalism, then, this question ultimately doesn't matter that much. Unless you're a theist, and then you can kind of make it matter, right? But yeah, I don't know. I guess I'm just really just begging people to start asking these kinds of deep questions, and that's why I want to do these videos, is so that we can, maybe I can be a catalyst for people to ask these sorts of questions, no matter where you're coming from. So again, I want to thank you guys so much for all your support, and your prayers, your comments, all of that. Feel free to obviously subscribe to the YouTube channel. You can also find me on Facebook, Catholicism in the Car. On Facebook, you can find me on Twitter at PZ Catechesis, and also on Anchor Podcast, Apple Podcast, pretty much every podcast place out there except SoundCloud, because SoundCloud is not the best, in my opinion. They don't really let me. You have to choose like one hosting source for your podcast, and SoundCloud is not one of Anchor's hosting, or Anchor's distributing podcast sources. I'm just mumbling up the words here, but anyway. So you can't find me on SoundCloud, but pretty much everywhere else you can, and I've listed all that in the descriptions of every video. So feel free, please, to subscribe or to like the Facebook page, or to, whatever people do on Twitter. Do they retweet? I don't know that much about Twitter. I'm just there. I just post stuff. So, yeah, all right. Well, let's do this. I don't know what I'm going to do about the Catholicism in the Car name anymore, if half my videos are not in the car, but we'll see. All right. Thanks, guys.